Imagine your child leaves home one afternoon and never comes back. At first, you search the neighborhood, then the nearby streets, then every place your child has ever visited. Hours become days, days become weeks. You go to the police, you beg them to help, but nobody seems concerned. Then another child disappears, and another, and another. Soon, the entire village is searching for children who never returned home. What began as a series of missing children cases would eventually lead to a horrifying discovery, one that would soon become one of the most horrifying criminal investigations in modern India. Welcome to the Inner Room. This is the story of the Nithari killings. In the early 2000s, Nithari was a small village on the outskirts of Noida, Uttar Pradesh. Tucked between old neighborhoods and the expanding skyline, Nithari was home to hundreds of working class families trying to survive in the shadow of wealth. Daily wage laborers, domestic workers, drivers, security guards, and housemaids lived here. Many worked in the affluent sectors of Noida while returning every evening to modest homes and narrow lanes. Children played outside, neighbors knew one another, and life followed a familiar rhythm. It was not a wealthy community, but it was a close knit one. Yet beneath that sense of normalcy, something deeply troubling was beginning to unfold. Over time, children started disappearing. One family reported a missing son, another searched for a missing daughter. At first, each case appeared isolated. There was no obvious connection, no clear suspect, and no reason to believe the disappearances were a part of something larger. But as the number of missing children continued to rise, fear slowly began spreading through the village. Parents started watching their children more closely. Rumors circulated, questions were asked, and before long, an entire community found itself living under a cloud of anxiety. The disappearances that would eventually bring national attention to Nithari did not occur in a single week or even a single month. They unfolded gradually between 2005 and 2006. Children vanished without explanation. Some disappeared while playing outside. Others went missing after venturing only a short distance from home. Their families launched desperate searches. Parents checked hospitals, police stations, bus terminals, and neighboring communities. Missing person complaints were filed, yet many families later claimed their concerns were not treated with urgency. Some were told their children may have run away. Others were advised to wait. As weeks turned into months, frustration deepened into despair. Most of the missing children came from economically disadvantaged families with little influence or ability to attract media attention. They simply wanted their children back. As more disappearances occurred, fear spread throughout the village. Residents began asking difficult questions. Was a kidnapping gang operating in the area? Was human trafficking involved? Could an organ trafficking racket be targeting children? Were the children being taken somewhere else? Nobody knew. The only certainty was the children were disappearing, and no one could explain why. Just a short distance away from Nithari stood a house in Sector 31, identified as D5. To anyone passing by, it appeared ordinary. The property belonged to businessman Moninder Singh Pandher, whose primary residence was in Chandigarh and who visited the Noida house periodically, often in connection with business. Also living and working at the property was a domestic worker named Surinder Kohli. At the time, the house went largely unnoticed. There was nothing about it that appeared unusual. To most people, it was simply another residence in a prosperous part of Noida. Yet, as the disappearances continued, some residents later claimed that several missing children had been seen in the vicinity of the house. However, these accounts remained unverified, and there was no evidence linking the property to the missing children. From the outside, nothing about the house suggested that it would soon become one of the most infamous addresses in India. While parents in Nithari searched desperately for answers, D5 remained quiet, unremarkable, and largely unnoticed. In 2005, a 22-year-old woman was reported missing. Unlike many of the other missing children cases, she was an adult. According to investigators, she was known to Moninder Singh Pandher and had visited D5 house before her disappearance. Investigators later claimed that she had visited the house on previous occasions to provide escort services to Pandher, something he himself acknowledged in a later interview. Her father, however, argued that this did not make her disappearance any less deserving of a proper investigation. Refusing to give up, he repeatedly approached the police and continued searching for answers. Then came December 2006, when everything changed. According to widely reported accounts, local children were playing cricket near the D5 house when their ball rolled towards a nearby drain. As they went to retrieve it, they noticed what appeared to be human remains and alerted local residents. Police searched the area behind the house and recovered additional remains. As investigators worked to identify the remains, attention returned to the missing woman's case. Some of the remains recovered near the property were later linked to her, identifying her as one of the victims connected to the case. As investigators revisited her disappearance, they traced activity on her phone to the D5 house, helping connect her case to the property. The discoveries also raised serious questions about the role of the police. Families had been reporting disappearances for months. Parents had repeatedly approached authorities, filed complaints, and pleaded for help. Yet many of those warnings appeared to receive little attention. By the time the remains were discovered behind the D5 house, many were left wondering whether earlier action could have prevented at least some of the tragedy. As police continued searching the area, more skeletal remains and body parts were recovered in and around the property. What had begun as a search for one missing person was rapidly becoming something far larger. The discovery of human remains changed everything. What had begun as a series of missing children cases was now drawing national attention. As public outrage grew and questions mounted over the handling of the case, the investigation was handed over to the Central Bureau of Investigation, better known as the CBI. The agency now faced the daunting task of identifying victims, reconstructing events, and determining what had actually happened in Nithari. Attention quickly focused on Moninder Singh Pandher and Surinder Kohli, the two men connected to the house D5 in Sector 31. As investigators closed in on the property, both men were taken into custody and questioned. DNA profiling became a crucial part of the investigation as forensic teams worked to match recovered remains with families who had reported missing children. As investigators examined the evidence, Surinder Kohli allegedly made confessional statements that shocked the country. According to investigators, Kohli confessed to the killing of the 22-year-old woman whose disappearance had helped lead authorities to the D5 house. He claimed that she had come to meet Pandher, after which Kohli sexually assaulted and killed her before disposing of her remains. Investigators further alleged that Kohli described luring victims into the house, sexually assaulting some of them, killing them, dismembering their bodies, and disposing of the remains. The confessions focused heavily on Kohli, but they also raised an obvious question. If these crimes had taken place inside the house over an extended period, how could Moninder Singh Pandher have been unaware of what was happening? Investigators would continue examining his role, and that question would remain at the center of the case for years to come. They also claim that Kohli confessed to cooking and consuming parts of some victims' bodies. The allegations fueled widespread reports of cannibalism and turned the case into one of the most horrifying stories India had ever witnessed. Television channels carried daily updates. Public fascination quickly turned into horror. As details emerged, numerous theories began circulating, including speculation about larger criminal networks. Investigators explored multiple possibilities while attempting to separate evidence from rumor. The deeper investigators dug, the larger the case appeared to become. Additional remains were recovered, and more missing person cases came under scrutiny. What had initially appeared to be a local tragedy was now being examined as a case with national implications. Yet, even as investigators worked to piece together what had happened, questions about the quality of the investigation would eventually emerge. Years later, the confessions, the circumstances under which they were obtained, and some of the conclusions drawn from them would face intense legal scrutiny. What initially seemed like a solved case would gradually evolve into one of the most complex criminal investigations in India's history. By now, Nithari had become a household name. Television channels provided round the clock coverage, and newspapers carried front page stories almost daily. What had started as a series of missing children complaints in a small village had become one of the biggest stories in the country. Public anger intensified with every new revelation. People struggled to understand how so many children could disappear over such a long period without triggering a larger response. Questions were no longer directed only at the accused. They were now being directed at the system itself. Why had the disappearances not been taken more seriously? Why had families spent months and in some cases years searching for answers on their own? As scrutiny increased, allegations of negligence against local authorities came under the spotlight. For many observers, the case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a story about institutional failure, accountability, and whether the voices of poor families had been ignored. The families of the victims became the emotional center of the national conversation. Many spoke publicly about their frustration, grief, and helplessness. Their stories resonated across the country because they reflected a fear every parent could understand. Nithari was no longer just a crime story. It had become a symbol of unanswered questions, shattered trust, and a community that felt abandoned long before the rest of the country finally began paying attention. As the investigation moved into the legal system, the story entered a new phase. Charges were filed, trials began, and evidence collected during the investigation was presented before the courts. One of the most significant developments was Surinder Kohli's confessional statements, which became a central part of the prosecution's case. During the investigation, both Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandher made statements that appeared to acknowledge certain activities connected to the case, while also shifting responsibility onto one another. As the investigation progressed, both men altered or disputed parts of those statements, creating further controversy around the case and the evidence being presented in court. For many people following the investigation, the confessions appeared to provide answers to a mystery that had haunted Nithari for years. In the years that followed, Kohli faced multiple trials connected to different victims. He was convicted in several cases and received multiple death sentences. Over time, those sentences appeared increasingly likely to be carried out. Mercy petitions were rejected, execution dates were scheduled, and at one stage, Kohli came extremely close to being hanged. Pandher also faced legal proceedings in several cases. While he was convicted in some proceedings, he was acquitted in others, creating a legal battle that would continue for years. For many observers, the verdicts appeared to bring a sense of closure. After years of uncertainty, it seemed the legal system had identified those responsible and delivered justice. Across much of the country, there was a widespread belief that the case had finally been solved. But the story did not end there. As appeals moved through higher courts, lawyers challenged key parts of the investigation and the evidence presented during trial. They also questioned the reliability of the confessional statements that had helped secure the convictions. Over time, several convictions were reviewed, overturned, or subjected to lengthy legal challenges. Years passed and the legal battle continued. Surinder Kohli spent approximately 16 years on death row while appeals and reviews worked their way through the courts. As higher courts re examined the case, convictions that had once appeared final began facing fresh scrutiny. What had once seemed like a settled case was gradually becoming one of the most disputed criminal cases in India's legal history. For years, the country believed the case had been solved. Convictions had been secured, death sentences had been handed down, and the public narrative appeared settled. But as higher courts revisited the evidence and examined the case more closely, that certainty began to fade. Questions that once seemed answered were suddenly being asked again. Nearly 2 decades had passed since the discoveries in Nithari first shocked the nation. During that time, the case moved through multiple courts, generated countless headlines, and became one of the most extensively discussed criminal investigations in modern India. What many people remembered were the horrific allegations, the arrests, and the convictions that followed. But the final legal chapters of the story unfolded very differently from what most expected. As higher courts revisited the evidence and examined the prosecution's case in greater detail, serious concerns were raised regarding the investigation and the reliability of key evidence. In 2023, Allahabad High Court acquitted Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandher in earlier cases, ruling that the prosecution had failed to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Following the acquittals, Moninder Singh Pandher was released. Later, Surinder Kohli, who had spent approximately 16 years on death row and nearly 2 decades in prison, was also released as convictions against him were overturned. The outcome stunned many people who had followed the case for years. The two men once presented as the central figures in one of India's most notorious criminal cases were now free. For Moninder Singh Pandher's family, the acquittals marked the end of a legal battle that had stretched across nearly 2 decades. His son Karan Singh Pandher, a lawyer, spent years fighting the case in court, maintaining that his father had been wrongly implicated. Today, Nithari occupies a unique place in India's criminal history. The discoveries made in 2006 remain undisputed. The family's loss remains undeniable. Yet the legal journey that followed continues to raise questions.
ये तो कानून बहुत गलत किया है जो उसको बरी कर दिया है। हम सोच रहे थे अभी तक हमारा कोर्ट जो है जज फैसला जो है इसको सही सुनाएगा और उनको फांसी लगेगी।
For the families of Nithari, this story was never about headlines. It was never about television debates, court judgments, or the endless stream of news coverage that followed. It began with something far simpler. A child who did not come home, a mother waiting at the door, a father searching through the night. Nearly 2 decades later, many of those families are still searching for something else. Closure. The case also leaves behind uncomfortable questions about the justice system itself. After nearly 2 decades of investigations, trials, and appeals, The people once convicted in one of India's most controversial and disturbing criminal cases returned to society, while many families were left without the certainty they had spent years searching for. In the years that followed, Moninder Singh Pandher appeared in several media interviews maintaining that he had been wrongly implicated and questioning whether the full truth had ever emerged. His voice continued to be heard. But what about the families? Many came from poor and working class backgrounds, without the money, influence, or resources needed to fight a years-long legal battle or keep their voices in the public conversation. The victims were real. The families were real. The grief was real. Human remains linked to 19 victims, most of them children and young women from impoverished families, were recovered during the investigation. Yet many of the answers remain disputed. If the answers we believed in were not enough, then what really happened in Nithari? And perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all is that we may never know.
एक मुनिंदर साहब जो पूरे केस स्टडी से लेकर सारी बातें आपने खुद एक्सेप्ट किया है कि अक्सर जब आप रात को कभी आया करते थे तो आप अपने इस कोठी में पार्टी किया करते थे और आप स्कॉट बुलाया करते थे, क्या ये सच है?
स्कॉट वाली कहानी सच है और जो आप कहते हो पार्टी वाली कहानी ये गलत है। सिर्फ एक ही पार्टी इस घर में हुई है और वो मैं नहीं था, वो सिर्फ एक ही पार्टी थी, वो मेरा जन्मदिन था।
अच्छा,